by the military-industrial complex.
And now, the Taliban will pay a price.
Do we have the confidence to do in the Middle East what our fathers and grandfathers accomplished in Europe and Asia?
The situation in Afghanistan is deteriorating.
What I do oppose is a dumb war.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Boardwalk Podcast. This is episode 19 of season 2, so the penultimate episode before we take a 3-month break. For tonight's episode, we're going to be talking about corruption. It's something that we have referenced a lot in the year that we've been doing this, but we haven't really gotten into what corruption in Afghanistan looks like. So for tonight's episode, at the 11th hour, I reached out to Frank Vogl to come on and speak about corruption in Afghanistan. Frank is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University who teaches a graduate level course on corruption, security, and conflict resolution. He also was the co-founder, or he founded 2 international NGOs, one of them being Transparency International, which we've actually used their corruption perception index when we talked about Russia and Ukraine, and he also founded the Public Trust Fund. Is that correct, Frank?
The Partnership for Transparency Fund.
Sorry, not even close. And within that, Frank serves as the chairman of the board. So very happy to have you on here, Frank. I know I kind of did a little introduction as to your background, but we'll slide it back over to you if there's anything you want to bring up front, and then we'll get into Afghanistan.
Well, it's a terrific pleasure to be with you. I was born in Britain. I was a foreign correspondent for a number of years, ended up, because there was a story called Watergate in Washington, D.C. for the Times of London. I was here for 8 years, then became the chief spokesman for the World Bank, traveled very much around the world for 9 years. And then in 1993, together with some friends for the World Bank, we started Transparency International as the first global anti-corruption organization. We now operate in 100 countries. I write a lot, lecture a lot, teach, try to encourage young people to get into anti-corruption. And I have a brand new book called The Enablers. And it is brand new. It's how the West supports kleptocrats and corruption endangering our democracy. And it seems very appropriate to Afghanistan and to, of course, Russia and Ukraine as well.
Yeah. So I'll be sure to buy that. I might buy 2 so if I can get you to sign one for me. I guess to start it off, when we talk about corruption, particularly in Afghanistan, I don't think people understand, like, how do we define corruption other than, everybody knows what bribery is, right? But corruption is so much deeper than that, Frank. So like, how would you in Transparency International and the PTF, how would you guys describe what is corruption?
We can have corruption in many forms, but what really focuses us is the abuse of public office for personal benefit. So whether it's a local government warlord, whether it's the central government's head of the government and all of his cronies and his associates, if they are stealing the people's funds and putting it in their pockets, that for us is grand corruption. There is a corollary here. Where you have a lot of that kind of grand corruption, then you have a lot of petty corruption. And petty corruption is the extortion of ordinary people by low-level officials, mostly police, often security forces, often doctors, often school teachers. You have to pay a bribe to get your child into a school. So we have petty corruption, but it only really functions when there's massive grand corruption, which is unfortunately so often the case in countries which do not have long democratic traditions and clear separation of powers. But before we go any further, look, there's lots of corruption in the United States. So I'm not making any exceptions here. This is a universal problem. It's just a matter of degree.
Oh no, we're corrupt here too. We just have like electricity and flushing toilets.
So, what would you say, Frank, would make? Obviously, you said there's corruption in the United States, but on your index, when you rank it, it's like there's a huge difference. There's probably a vast divide between the corruption present in a place like Afghanistan or, North Korea. What we know about North Korea, anyway, versus someplace like the United States or Britain or someplace like that. So, what would you say is the common thing that would make Afghanistan so much more corrupt?
Think of the world and all countries in three categories. Countries that are democratically ruled, where there is a clear rule of law, a separation of power, and the rule of law is not totally controlled by the government. It's a separate branch. Maybe 50 countries like that, from Norway and Sweden and Finland through the United States to Japan and so on. A second category is countries which are either under a total dictatorship, like Russia, like China, like Iran, or well on the way to becoming a dictatorship, where essentially the national leaders put themselves above the law. They appoint the judges, they appoint the police, they appoint the intelligence services, and therefore they have impunity. And with that impunity, they steal from their people. And all those autocracies are kleptocracies, meaning the top guys steal. And then there is a third category that we've come to know as failed states. Afghanistan is one of those. Somalia is another one of those. These are countries for a very long time. Yemen, South Sudan. For a very long time, these countries have not been able to get a coherent central government, to get a public respect for the rule of law. Instead, there's been continuous civil war, continuous civil strife. And so they've got this reputation of failed states. And in failed states, bribery, extortion becomes the absolute routine way of life. And it's, of course, the people who suffer most are the poorest people. They're always on the receiving end of being extorted. And they're the victims.
Does economic viability, like what role does that play into it? Because when we look at, like Kyle said, when you look at the countries at the very bottom, one, they are failed states, but also when you look at economic output, it's almost non-existent, right? The average Afghan makes something like $500 a year. However, there's literally trillions of dollars in mineral resources, granted recently discovered, but trillions of dollars of mineral resources in that country that can be mined and shipped out for profit. So is it that there's a lack of economic opportunity, or is it just that the whatever form of local or national governance is so inept that it doesn't matter?
Well, so much of the mineral resources that are mined and exported from Afghanistan are smuggled out. They go through illicit channels, and the people themselves in Afghanistan don't benefit. Small cliques of very powerful people benefit, of course. It's the same with the opium trade. This is a huge, as you know much better than I, a huge industry in Afghanistan. But the farmers and the rural people really get very, very little out of it, whilst various, people at the top of the chain, as it were, take all the profits. So in these situations, we see this a lot in quite a few resource-rich countries. From the Congo to Venezuela with its oil and so on, countries that may have tremendous natural resources, but they are exported essentially through illicit means, and the public don't benefit.
Yeah, I think as far as the certain cliques benefiting, we saw part of that with the bazaar owners on the different military bases in the when we were deployed. I'm sure they weren't putting all of their lapis lazuli sales up in their W-2 form every year, and if they were, not much of that was making it to the to public works and such.
Yeah, when you talk about you know how the lack of trickle down, if you will, of that or poppy money or opium money. I showed Kyle and Stu one day. Hamid Karzai's brother on Wikipedia said that he was most known for his family owning a restaurant in Baltimore. But we all know Hamid Karzai's brother for being the most notorious at the time poppy smuggler in Afghanistan. Like, he was the richest warlord, or yeah, he's a warlord. He was the richest warlord based solely on his poppy trafficking, and he had the ultimate protection. His brother was the president.
Well, his brother was the president, and for various foreign policy reasons, the U.S. decided not to go against the brother. The critical point in time, I think, was from everything I've read and heard and talked to people about, and my own colleagues who worked for TI in Afghanistan in different ways. The critical point was the bankrupting of the Kabul bank. Here was a bank, the average Afghan in 2010 was, as you said, terribly poor, was earning $2 a day or something. How could they imagine that the Kabul bank would suddenly, from one day to the next, lose $900 million? And if my memory serves me right from everything I read, General McMaster, who later became National Security Chief of the White House for a short period of time, was in Afghanistan at that time, was very, very concerned about the Karzai family. And not just the Karzai family, because the vice president of Hamid Karzai was Marshal Fahim. And his brother, together with Karzai's brother, were big shareholders in the Kabul bank. And when an attempt was made to arrest one of Karzai's deputies, Michael Saleh, the U.S. had all the evidence, all the charges. Karzai immediately got him out of jail and dismissed the charges. And over the Kabul bank, U.S. military, as far as I know, tried very, very hard to bring prosecutions against Karzai's brother. And ultimately, as I read it, the State Department basically said, back off. We need to have a relationship with Karzai, however bad that is, and we cannot put that total relationship at stake in order to just jail his brother.
What do you think?
And
sorry, go ahead.
And all I wanted to say was that you have a lot of on-the-ground experience. This is absolutely the crunch issue. Where does U.S. policy reach the conclusion we have to tolerate the massive theft of the public's resources and the lawlessness in order to maintain a strategic relationship that serves our perceived military and diplomatic ends, even if in the end it doesn't? But it's a terribly difficult question.
So, Frank, in 2017, that was the internal conversation was effective corruption versus ineffective corruption. To answer your question on how we approach the topic, I'll let Kyle go now.
No, I was going to ask a question though. It's like, how do you as a first world nation, Frank, and as somebody who is in charge or is affiliated with these NGOs, how do you sit and say, well, we know this man is corrupt. We know he's bankrupted the Kabul bank, right? We know he's done these things. We have charges, but at what point do we say, well, but Afghanistan's a sovereign nation, so can't they make these decisions themselves? It's like, and what authority do we as the United States have to basically police their corruption when it's their state? How do you balance that, or what are your thoughts on infringing on another nation's sovereignty to do, what's best for them. Is that possible?
I think this is an incredibly important question. I think it's a difficult question for all governments, but where, in my opinion, U.S. policy often went wrong vis-a-vis Afghanistan and earlier, and basically vis-a-vis the invasion in Iraq as well, was that corruption was always seen as a secondary issue to security. So we deployed troops, we deployed forces to create a secure environment, meaning that people weren't getting shot every 3 minutes. And then we said, once we have the secure environment, then we'll deal with the corruption. And the truth is that when you have failed states, if you don't deal with the justice system as part and parcel, intrinsic to the security issue, and not as something you deal with afterwards, you will never get the security. And the effort is to develop a consciousness where the military mission places the issue of justice and law enforcement in and meaning law enforcement that is fair for everybody, and not putting some people above the law, has not been very rarely, even if the top generals have understood the concept, have not been able to fully put the law enforcement issue and the justice issue into the mission as integral to the security issue. And so when you go and you deal with Hamid Karzai, or you deal with Ashraf Ghani in Afghanistan, you have to say, we cannot put American troops, we cannot risk their lives to build security in your country if you're not willing to do what is necessary to create a system of meaningful justice for all citizens. And we didn't go that far. And I just want to make one point. There was a brilliant study done by the Inspector General for Iraq, a guy called Bowen, who wrote all the lessons learned from Iraq about why they did all of this wrong. And the big frustration for a number of people was, he wrote this book in 2012, something like that. And it was those lessons were never really picked up in Afghanistan. And it was the same situation. And you have political chaos basically in Iraq today. And of course, Afghanistan.
Do you think that corruption is basically, because we didn't deal with it, we essentially went and planted over this corrupt, kind of festering pile that was there anyway? And so we were like, well, we're going to come in here, we're going to make it secure, but it's still the same corrupt mob that's been here, for 40, 50 years at this point. And we're just going to build up on top of it, but it can't stand. There's no foundation for a society if you don't change that, if you can't alter that foundation.
Yeah, but before we get too theoretical, you have to go back and you ask, what was the U.S. mission in Afghanistan? And if you said the mission was nation building, then we can talk about all manner of issues: law enforcement, economic security, providing basic economic opportunities to all citizens, and the whole pile of stuff. And if we had ever imagined we'd be there for 20 years, that would have been the right approach. But as I said, you know much better than I, that was never really accepted as the mandate. And the real tragedy in recent years was that, unlike Karzai, Ghani really understood these issues. The trouble was, and he didn't have a corrupt brother. And we didn't have a camelback under Ghani. But the trouble was he was essentially an isolated and weak leader. That comes to your real question. I mean, it's not for the US to start changing regimes.
History says otherwise.
Well,
Can we sound clip that, please, for our for our intro?
Yeah, it was
We've
great.
been harking on that issue for a long time.
well, I mean, we can look at history, but let's put it this way: we had the potential of a much better partner in Ghani than we did in Karzai, and unfortunately, he just didn't have the base of political power necessary to enforce very tough decisions in the area of justice and building a justice system. And it's a great tragedy. And therefore the corruption, which was been there for hundreds of years, it wasn't a new problem. Albeit it became more sophisticated and frankly it became larger in terms of real hard dollars, just continued and continued. And we never confronted the Pakistanis about it because they supported it.
Yeah, for sure. You could see how weak Ghani was when he he removed Adenor from his position as the provincial governor of Balkh. And Adenor just said no, and he just kept his position as provincial governor. Like, no one did anything. Nobody went to take him out. Like, there was no removal. He just said no, and he just remained the provincial governor. So that's interesting that you mentioned that, because that was always an issue when I was doing political research over there, was just how weak and how Ghani had no base except we liked him. So, but that doesn't, hold a lot of weight with the Afghan people.
And there were many, Americans, not military, who went to Afghanistan in different capacities to help with the budget process, with trying to help with policing and providing advice, with building hospitals and schools and so on, who all meant so well, and who felt, and I've talked to a number of them, who really felt they were making some progress, but it was never enough. And I don't think, frankly, that was a U.S. responsibility. But I think the U.S., and I blame the State Department a great deal. I blame the National Security Council and the CIA a great deal. Were not willing to be open and candid about these issues, leaving a tremendous challenge to the military.
Yeah, and I think those issues kind of stem back to a point you made a second ago, where talking about what was the mission in Afghanistan, because clearly, if we were planning on rebuilding the nation from the get-go, we would have had a plan in motion, kind of coinciding with the invasion almost. But it seems like instead we went in with, fire and brimstone and cleared out the current government, and then had to stop and ponder what to do now. And that kind of led us to getting our hands in with some fairly unsavory and corrupt characters.
Well, it was worse than that. But come on, it was worse than that, because we also put in a huge amount of so-called reconstruction money into Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And a lot of that went to projects that, because they were in very insecure or unsafe areas, could not be properly monitored. So an enormous amount of US taxpayer money, let's put it like that, simply disappeared. And everybody knew it. And yet it continued year after year after year, as if that was the sort of symbolic nation building that we were doing beyond the military assignments. And the tragedy about it was widely talked about. Everybody knew it. Everybody saw it. And yet, somehow or other, something was going on in Washington which couldn't stop it.
Well,
And
they weren't hearing about it, Frank.
and by the way, and the same happened in Iraq.
Yep.
And I think there has not been a meaningful, review in Washington about those aspects of our engagement in Afghanistan, and it's very, very sad. And I'm really worried about whether we've learned the lessons before we go into another engagement somewhere. And so I come back to this point: if there is not a priority, in my opinion, on creating a system of justice that all citizens believe is fair, then I think corruption will be rampant and it will undermine security and lead either to a failed state situation or eventually to a very harsh dictatorship. Neither of which we want.
So I think the question that arises from that, Frank, and I don't disagree with you at all, is how does that look in a country where there is a weak central government and you have, at best, local allegiances and significant cultural and tribal differences in the span of rivers sometimes?
It looks very bad. It's very, very tough. And many people have got different theories about how you go about it. But I believe in that situation, if you cannot get widespread economic growth going, which provides all people, with a sense of economic security, and therefore a sense of hope that things could get better, you won't even get to first base. And very often in post-Civil War situations, you've got both the physical security against violence situation, but you've also got destitution, and you've got an urgency to create economic security as well, and then economic opportunity. And the more there is economic opportunity, the more people demand themselves the systems of reform and justice that they want, and they potentially can succeed. But it's very, very difficult. And if an outside force comes in and says, okay, this is the way it's going to be, and this is what you got to do, it ain't going to work.
I found it interesting that in one of the half dozen documentaries I've watched about Afghanistan, we've got American service members trying to explain to the Afghans the concept of taxes. And they say, "Oh, that's just theft. That's all that. That's just stealing." But at the same time, the United Nations, the Office for for drugs and crimes, they surveyed Afghans about 10 years ago, right, and found that about half of the Afghans say that they have to pay some sort of a bribe to get just your standard daily tasks done, to register a vehicle, because there's something like 24 different signatures you need. And I'm sure a big part of that is that if you have enough money in Afghanistan to buy a car, you got enough money to give every official along the way an extra 500 Afghani on the way to actually being able to drive that car.
Yes, but again, it's there is a structure to corruption. Sometimes we think it's haphazard, but it actually usually is pretty organized. And again, we come back, the guy at the bottom who has no leverage is extorted everywhere. But you just take, a school. If you have to pay for your kid to get into the school under the table, right? The teacher demands it. Why does the teacher demand it? Because the teacher has to pay the principal in order for the teacher to get his job. The principal has to pay the guy above him to keep his job. And this goes all the way up the system. So every it, in the end, the teacher may be completely incompetent as a teacher, but he was able to extract money from the parents to keep his job. And so it goes up. So the kids get a lousy education and the parents are extorted at the same time. And this goes all the way up, and you'll find it in the Department of Motor Vehicles, and you'll find it in the local health clinics, and you'll find it across the board. But as everybody's paying off, the guys at the middle levels of officialdom, they are so much on the take that they order the guys below them around. And so they don't pay any bribes for their cars. They don't pay, in fact, they get cars as part of their perks. And so it goes on. I know of countries where the police are, regular policemen are bribing senior policemen to get the best assignments. So, for example, they know that it's really good to have an assignment for traffic to the airport, because that means people who go to the airport are well off. And it's much easier to shake them down for real money than to be assigned to some rural village where nobody really has any money anyhow. So, this is unfortunately widespread across the world. And the tragedy, I think, in Afghanistan was that there were never consistent longer-term approaches to really deal with this, even though a lot of people had analyzed it from every perspective.
How would you deal with it, Frank? I know that's a very broad, that's a hard question. What would you say, maybe three things that we could have done, or that you would recommend that we could have done to at least start fixing it, if it's even possible? I don't know.
Well, I think first of all, the responsibility lies with the citizens of the country. So it takes time to understand what their priorities are, what their desires from the state are. We have had a rather naive view for a very long time that if a country holds elections, then it's on the way to democracy. Well, in many countries, the citizens don't know what elections are, and they have no experience of elections. And if you were to ask them what are their priorities, elections would be sort of number 25 or something. So I come back to this. Citizens almost everywhere want security against violence and economic security to provide them with the opportunities to build decent lives for themselves. And if they seek foreign support for those things, then that's what the foreign supporters should concentrate on. And once you can get that going, once you can really get these two things coming together, which demands a justice system, because it won't work if you don't have some sort of rule of law that everybody abides by and everybody considers fair. Because then you won't get economic opportunity for everybody, and you won't get the security for everybody. But if you can get that going, that is a basis for progress that will take years to fully mature and develop. I don't think there's actually that much disagreement about that. The trouble really is that US engagement and Western engagement so often is determined in advance on a short-term basis. We don't make long-term commitments. We just renew commitments, but we don't make the long-term commitment. Our politicians have changing priorities. So, yeah, we may be deeply involved with one part of the world and one country for a period of time, and then we lose interest. And we leave a system or a country which is making some progress rather in the lurch. And more fundamentally to that, I think that the US itself has a huge obligation to do everything it can to promote civil society in countries. In other words, groups that really represent citizens to promote human rights and preserve human rights and basically freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. And this is very, very tough. And I don't think, I don't think these things got the consistent priority in Afghanistan that they should have got, even though there were times when these issues were at the forefront of our policymakers.
Yeah, and it's such a you were saying, corruption is often structured, and in Afghanistan it's closely so closely tied together with all of the problems they have. You have one of the poorest countries in the world per capita, where people are essentially getting fleeced for trying to conduct regular daily activities. You have the ghost soldier problem with the military and local security forces, where they're understaffed and their mid to high level commanders are pocketing salaries for soldiers that aren't even there, and that's causing soldiers, down at the bottom to be less capable of providing that security. And it all kind of links together to sort of a perfect storm for the average person.
Yeah, and it's you know it's so sad because we so many incredibly courageous people devoted, including you, went to Afghanistan to do the right thing. We put so much cash basically into the effort at the same time. And yet there was an inconsistent policies. There was a lack of clarity about the mission in the terms that we're talking about tonight. And at the same time, we were all too willing to support a political leadership in Afghanistan for many, many years that was absolutely rotten.
I think it's fair to say that the U.S. government um, overestimated or overvalued Hamid Karzai's influence in the South, just because Afghanistan is highly tribal, and while Hamid Karzai being a Pashtun meant that he had roughly 40% of the support of the country, and that would be the largest percentage of support. It's not that majority, right? There's still 58 to 60% of people who don't trust him based solely on him being a member of the Pashtun family or the Pashtun tribe, and then others who know him as a member of the Karzai family directly. Uh, but I did want to bring up. I love that Stu pointed out the ghost soldiers, which we've brought up several times. That you know, ghost soldiers was basically a way for commanders to get paid more by saying I've got 50 soldiers when they
Sure.
really only
Yeah,
have 20.
yeah.
I found in some research leading up to this, Stu, you'll love this. There were ghost teachers,
Oh,
Oh wow.
people within the Ministry of Education, from the district level up to the Jeroa Ministry of Education, were lying about the number of teachers on the
oh, wait
books.
a minute, wait a minute,
And
wait a minute. Let me stop you. In Pakistan, there are ghost schools. Forget the ghost teachers. There are whole schools that are on the books of the Ministry of Education where the salaries of the teachers and everything else are being paid, but the school doesn't even exist. And don't and here, why should we be surprised if we see the habits and things that go on in Pakistan about whether they happen in Afghanistan as well? There has been a incredible sophistication on the part of people in many, many countries about how to abuse Western aid. Because after all, we were providing the budgets for most of the military and those ghost soldiers. We were providing the budgets for a lot of the education department's budget and so on. And it takes, fairly savvy guys at the other end to know how to play the system to become very rich as a result. And unfortunately, when there's a war going on, we tend to constantly say to the bean counters, "Oh, you don't understand. The system's working. Don't look too hard at what's going on." And in countries, by the way, where there is peace and there is potential for development, those bean counters get in the way terribly in terms of delaying projects and sometimes becoming so bureaucratic that the good stuff doesn't happen. Nevertheless, my point is, we provided a huge amount of aid, military aid, non-military aid in Afghanistan that very, very clever people were able to pocket for themselves. And time and again, American officials and foreign aid officials turned a blind eye.
Well, it's not their money, Frank. It's our money.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I don't think that was, I don't think that's the way it really is looked at. I think it's more, if we really cause a storm about this, we may, in the end, get into lots of other political difficulties or other diplomatic difficulties. So let it go.
But
Terrible.
they had to have learned how to take advantage, like you said, Frank, because I think Afghanistan, most of its entire structure was funded by Western governments or Russia. I mean, for years and years. I mean, the same people were taking advantage of it. People like Dostum and Adenor and all these same people that were players in the 70s. They know how to take advantage of it because they
Sure.
started out. They did it a long time ago, and they've been doing it for 40, 50 years now.
Absolutely. And this kind of system, unfortunately, is replicated in quite a number of other countries. When you look at countries that are tremendously endowed with natural resources, and you see the level of poverty in those countries, it's pretty obvious, that there are some people who've exactly known how to screw the whole system, and they're very rich. And we see it in Russia, and we see it in Ukraine, and we see it, of course, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and some of the other stands.
I remember reading about just how bad things had gotten in Venezuela, where the Venezuelans were like killing family pets to eat them. And I saw a video of Nicolas Maduro being catered to by a Turkish chef who charges like $30,000 per plate of food. So yeah, that makes sense. You nationalize the oil industry that way. The people in government profit most off of it, and you don't really care about the other people.
No, and in the end, you bankrupt the oil industry. I mean, this is the crazy thing about it, that the thefts become, and this may, and this takes us back again to minerals in Afghanistan. What a tremendous potential that has been for the economy, and how sad it is that, from what I've been told, the Chinese have been very good at helping to smuggle quite a lot of those minerals into China, working with Afghans. But what a tragedy that here were our natural resources that really could have helped to the benefit of the people of Afghanistan, and they really didn't. And it's another aspect of this corruption. But also you have, and you know this again better than I, such a decentralized political system in Afghanistan. So that local, we call them warlords, but basically local governors, government, local officials have maybe for centuries looked after themselves first and foremost. To change that is something I don't think that any foreign government really can come in and do. And the warnings were there as far as Afghanistan is concerned, as you know very well from the history of that country.
Yeah, corruption isn't exactly something new. It's due to Americans as it pertains to Afghanistan, but like you said, this goes back generations. Like the idea of an Afghan police officer taxing a family to use Highway One is not some new phenomenon created by the introduction of the U.S. or NATO. This goes back to the days of you know the Afghan government liaising with the Soviets, and I think from my perspective, somebody who's not an expert in corruption, but I think a large part of the issue is just that so many people wake up and go, well, this is just how the system is. And I've got to deal with it this way.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah Chase, who's a friend, and she wrote a book about her. She was a journalist in Afghanistan and then lived there for 10 years. And then she somehow or other found a way to become an advisor to General Mullen. And she wrote a great book about Afghanistan and corruption. And she says, it is the system. Corruption is the system in the country. And if it's not, and the failure to recognize it as being the system leads you down all sorts of false paths, because you're constantly talking about elections and you're talking about central governance power and so on, and you're not really addressing the realities on the ground. And I think in many ways we've seen this in too many countries. We keep on making the same mistakes, and hopefully at least this will be one of the lessons that is truly learned. And I think I may be wrong here, but from what I'm told by other colleagues who know a lot about this, there is a far greater military sensitivity to this whole issue today about corruption as a result of the Afghan experience than was certainly the case 10 years ago.
What do you think, Frank? Just because we're getting close on time, and I've got a couple questions. The future of Afghanistan. Taliban are in charge now. They're back. I mean, they ran it before. What do you think that holds? Do you think it's more of the same? Do you think it gets worse? Do you think the Taliban figures out how to run a government this time? I don't know. What are your thoughts on Afghanistan? And then the second part, what countries do you see as becoming more and more corrupt that people should watch out for as far as that goes?
Well, on the first question, I mean, I don't know. I'm not sufficiently familiar. I fear that we will have a very, very brutal dictatorship in Afghanistan, that there will be a justice system, but essentially an injustice system. It'll be very brutal and very harsh on the citizens of that country. To answer your second question, one of the great horrible stories of COVID and the pandemic was that many governments around the world used the opportunity with lockdowns and things like that to actually make public procurement of healthcare, PPE, and stuff like that secret, to misallocate vaccines, to even get in. I mean, I heard a horrible story in Ecuador of massive overcharging of body bags from hospitals. I mean, the fraud that came out associated with COVID in many countries, and there was a lot of fraud, by the way, in the disbursement of COVID funds in the United States, has made countries that were on the way to being autocracies or dictatorships even further along that road. And whether it's Hungary or Serbia or some of the sub-Saharan African countries, Mexico, Brazil are certainly at risk when we talk about that. And the final point on that I would make, more journalists are in prison today or have lost their lives in the last couple of years because of autocratic governments. There are more civil society people locked up. China locks up most. Russia is a close second. But then Egypt and Turkey, strong, in many ways, allies of the United States, have locked up hundreds of civil society people and journalists. And that's one of the, when you look at how many people who are fighting for freedom or get locked up, or even talking about freedom get locked up, that's a sign of where that country is on the spectrum of democracy and autocracy.
I think, unfortunately, you have to kind of take that as a win when you consider that one of our biggest allies, and when I say our, I'm talking about the government, not the three of us for sure, is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that literally dismembered a journalist within an embassy. And we said nothing about it, right? And
Well, no,
because oil is
wait a minute.
that important.
We actually said, come buy more weapons.
Yes,
True. Yeah.
Thank you for that correction, Frank. Yeah, we told them to buy more stuff from us. It's very hard to be the. I don't like that people want America to be the world's police. I don't want us to be the world's police. I don't have a problem with us being a moral compass as long as we're not exerting and forcing people to do what we say. But at some point, you've got to put a foot down and say, you can't fucking dismember journalists and just expect things to be fine. It doesn't matter that oil is that important. And I think when we look at corruption in Afghanistan, and you brought it up at the very beginning, Frank, like America is not, we're not innocent of this. Britain is not innocent of this. France is not innocent of this. Like all these countries that were involved in this 20-year long effort in Afghanistan, we all have our own problems, and we continue to fail to address them. And so why should we expect to address them internationally?
Just a final, I mentioned my book at the beginning. I'd like to mention it again for one reason. The book is called The Enablers. And the reason for that, it's all the people on Wall Street or in the city of London or in Miami or in Vancouver who are aiding and abetting the brothers of Karzai and others to launder their money into our investments in our country. When you steal, whether it's from the poppy trade, the heroin business in Afghanistan, or from the minerals, or from the government, or from foreign aid, you get dollars. You can't invest them in Afghanistan. There's nowhere that you can put those dollars in Afghanistan. You want to get them out, and you want to get them into the U.S. stock exchange. You want to get them into real estate in the United States, and so on. And that means you have to find people, bankers, lawyers, accountants, financial consultants, who are going to help you to launder that cash into safe investments here in the United States. And we, unfortunately, so often in these discussions of corruption, talk only about the bad guys over there, the Karzai brothers, and so on. And we don't talk about the bad guys in our financial system, without whom the Karzais and others could not invest their cash. And in that sense, this is truly a universal problem of corruption. And I argue that there is too much money in our politics, and that money helps to create rather lax rules that allow for the inflow of maybe $600 billion a year in dirty cash, which is more than the annual sales of Walmart, which is, after all, the biggest retailer in the world. So we have a problem, and we should not divorce our problem from the problems in Afghanistan or in other countries. They are part and parcel of the same, basically dirty system. And if we want to make change in Afghanistan, we also have to make change here at home.
Thanks, Frank. Can you mention your book one more time, and we'll give you the floor at the last. We always give our guests the last, last statement. So mention your book, title of your book, and that sounds like an awesome.
Anyone can get it online. It's called The Enablers. It just came out at the end of last year. It's how the West supports kleptocrats and corruption, endangering our democracy.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on, Frank, especially at the last minute.
It's a great pleasure. Look, this is an
subject.
important discussion, and I'm delighted to meet you, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right.